Thank you very much, and I am absolutely delighted to be talking to you today. As I said, my research is in attitudes towards health and disease in the early Middle Ages, and that's roughly the period between 500 and 1100. There is an often erroneous idea that past societies were A, very sick, and B, didn't care about the sick. This, as I want to show, is not the case. I will show examples of illness, but I also want to show that ideas of what is sick and what needs healing are not the same as our own. For example, for most modern doctors, a disease is a biological imbalance that needs rectifying. But for medieval writers, there is a connection between body and soul, and so it is also a sociological discontinuity. It is clear that the Anglo-Saxons were familiar with disease, but the extent of sickness in this society can only be guessed. Diarrhea, fevers, and infectious diseases that are responsible for the high mortality of modern populations must have certainly been around, but we cannot show them on the bones. While all of us experience sickness at some stage of our lives, it is usually the onset of middle age, from whence we experience more problems with disease. I'm going to take this one here. Many illnesses, such as arthritis, then as now, are a matter of wear and tear. The bones of our ancestors, however, had to work much harder, and many show such telltale age markers a lot earlier. The aging of medieval populations is very complex, and there are still plenty of unknowns. Modern concepts of the Dark Ages have also obstructed these ideas because a lot of older research expected man not to outlive their 5th decade. Often, statistics of life expectancy are calculated on a median, which means that places with high infant mortality may give an erroneous impression of very brief lifespans, and a common popular perception of that people in the Middle Ages died young is based in such statistics. However, looking at historical sources, there are plenty of old people, from Charlemagne, who died in his 72nd year, to Eleanor of Aquitaine, who died at 83. Granted, most of the kings of Anglo-Saxon Wessex did not make it beyond their mid-50s, but we know that a chronic illness, we don't know which one, ran in the family, and that diseases killed kings such as Athelstan. Sally Crawford has done an examination of 12 early Anglo-Saxon cemeteries, and she has shown that at least 10% of the population outlived their 50th year. It is assumed that the population profile of Anglo-Saxon England was similar to that of modern pre-developing and developing countries, where the highest mortality is amongst the group of children and the elderly. However, this is also difficult to prove for us, since neonate and very young skeletons have not been discovered in a lot of cemeteries that have so far been excavated. So many assumptions about the fecundity and the health of early medieval populations remain speculative. Examples from texts and from bone assemblages give us a very good indication that while resources may have been limited, there was a wish to raise impaired children and also to treat people with ailments. However, in contrast to our modern perceptions of illness, which is also culturally dependent, medieval ideas of the reasons for sickness are diverse. Since the writing and the collection of texts was largely in the hands of the clergy, we do hear their voices most loudly when it comes to the questions of why people get sick. While there is evidence for healing in the pagan period, it is the conversion to Christianity which brought a new framework of ideas of disease. The success of Christianity in its early days was partly based in the fact that the adherents seems to have specifically given care, free healthcare, to the sick and the needy. From the 3rd century, influential writers such as Origen used medical analogies to show that unlike pagan deities, Christ was a physician of the soul as well as of the body. Christ is described as the great physician in these texts, and those who were in his ministry were also endowed with powers of healing and had to do healing. In the writings of the Church Fathers, medicine is a beneficial and a God-given ability. However, there is also a notion as early as Jerome that sickness is an outward sign of sin, and that a means of adjusting priorities. And I haven't got time to read this, but this is one of the Anglo-Saxon texts that kind of says, ooh, why do I suffer? No, don't complain about it. You know, if you are exalted, you are chosen, don't complain, because it gives you a chance to turn around, to contemplate that there is a much greater pain in the afterlife if you do not mend your ways. However, there is very little evidence that the sick are stigmatized in the Anglo-Saxon period. But they may have utilized a new form of healing, which was administered at the shrines of the saints. Saints were thought to be endowed with healing powers, and the emergence of shrines and sepulchres also attracted a number of the sick. We hear, for example, that at Winchester, you couldn't get through the churchyard, of the Church of St. Swithin, because it was full of cripples. It can be quite cruel. We hear, for example, how a paralytic boy is brought to St. Cuthbert in a litter, carried by his mother, and who is subsequently healed. But even in death, St. Cuthbert continues to heal those who are paralyzed. When a boy is brought to a monastery, and we are told that the condition was progressive, it had started in his feet, so that by the time he came to Lindisfarne, he could no longer move his limbs. And we're also told that he had been in medical care before, that he'd been with a doctor, but that he now needed the intervention of the heavenly physician. The boy is healed by stepping into the shoes of St. Cuthbert, and we're then told, so there is some interest in observing pathologies, that the disease is reversed, so the pathology is reversed, and that the muscles and sinews strengthen. The illness, which the text describes as what the Greeks called paralysis, is clearly seen as something that needs rectifying, but this is not always the case. In another religious text, a sermon by the influential 10th century cleric Alfred, we are told that a God-fearing woman called Romula also suffered from paralysis, and that she was bedridden. However, here the illness is seen as a good thing. Romula was good at praying for others. Her immobility is necessary to A, keep her from evil, after all, she is a woman, and B, so that she can concentrate better on her work. As this, she is much more important than other women or other people. Paralysis is thus presented as a desirable thing, at least when you're female. The connection between religious buildings and healthcare may have been anticipated in special temples that were associated with the cure of disease in ancient Greece. However, there is no evidence for a deliberate provision of care before Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire. In AD 325, the newly converted Emperor Constantine stipulated that hospitals should be constructed in every cathedral town. One of the first was under the directive of Basil of Caesarea, who was also an important canonical influence on the study of healing and disease in Christianity. The primary aim of these hospitals was not to cure, but to care for people who could not otherwise look after themselves, which included the old, the poor, as well as the sick and the impaired. Medieval monasteries had infirmaries, which were under the supervision of the cellarer, so the man who looks after the food. The earliest record for a hospital in Anglo-Saxon England is St. Peter at York, which was founded by King Athelstan in AD 937 and is situated roughly beneath the modern Theatre Royal. While there is not much documentary evidence for the founding of hospitals, there are plenty of monastic sites which contain graveyards with a high proportion of women and children, which are supposedly drawn from the lay population. However, not all healing was done in monasteries. By the time of late Anglo-Saxon England, which is around the 10th and 11th century, we do not only have named physicians, but also a range of medical textbooks, the so-called leech books. Anglo-Saxon doctors had access to classical training via Latin handbooks, as well as being instructed in native traditions. Recipes came from Greek and Roman medicine, as well as from Byzantine works. And apart from Galen, that are based in very other well-known medical authors such as Oribasius and Marcellus. Entries and Leech books often tell us that a certain treatment was taught by a named physician, which suggests that medicine was at least to a certain extent professional. Vernacular handbooks often incorporated classical training, which comes either directly or via other medical sources to the compiler of the manuscript. Well, we do not know how many people had access to such a trained physician. No surgery has hitherto been found. We only have some medical instruments. It is clear that healthcare providers in Anglo-Saxon England could offer the best that there was for its time. Among the Old English medical handbooks is Bald's Leech Book, named after his owner Bald, as well as the Lachnunga and a collection of recipes simply named Leech Book 3. Not all of these manuscripts are complete. We recently found a single leaf from a medical manuscript, the Ormond fragment, dated to the late 9th century, and it suggests that originally we had many, many more medical books. We also have occasional recipes and charms in the margins or as additions to other manuscripts. The medical texts of Anglo-Saxon England cover a remarkable list of ailments, from upset tummies to difficulties conceiving a child. The fact that we have treatments that are clearly aimed at a non-monastic population should not be surprising. Monasteries collected and preserved all kinds of knowledge. The ingredients of the Leech Book shows that healthcare in Anglo-Saxon England was a matter of economy. Bald's Leech Book, for example, was clearly written for patients with money, since many ingredients were very expensive imports. Interestingly, doctors are also given a choice of treatment for conditions, sometimes up to 65 different remedies for apparently the same illness. Well, it is perfectly possible that these are different etiologies because, after all, none of the recipes give us any kind of the number of ingredients. They just give us a list of ingredients. They don't tell us the proportions. They could also point to the fact that doctors had a range of different treatments that they could offer to patients. We do have some evidence for surgery. At Bishopston in Kent, cut marks on the bones of the edge of a wound to the knee suggest an attempt at surgery. A surgical procedure is described in Bald's Leech Book, and it's for the repair of a hair lip by using silk thread and some poultice. Spinal injuries, however, would have been extremely difficult to cure. But that does not mean they did not try. Leech Book 3 advises a steam bath with all kinds of tree barks, nightshade, radish and cucumber for a person who's been paralyzed. Well, the measure is heroic, it probably isn't doing very much for the patient. Before I move on to conditions that have been found on the spinal remains, I would like to add a caveat. Sorry about this. I would like to add a caveat. Not all people will be found, and what we have is just pockets of evidence. We need to remember that burial in a communal gravefield is always privileged, and that those who were thought to be other, such as criminals, were not included. We also need to remember that the earliest Anglo-Saxons cremated their dead, which is a bit inconvenient for us. There are a number of diseases which lead to the deformation of the spine and which have all been found in Anglo-Saxon cemeteries. Ankylosing spondylitis is relatively rare but has been found, but spondylolysis is more frequent, which is most likely to be a hazard associated with hard labor at a very early age in agriculture or manufacture. Some of the data suggest that at least some Anglo-Saxons struggled with diffuse idiopathic skeletal hyperostosis. And the earliest examples were found in monastic sites, so it was thought to be a fat person's disease. But increasingly, they are found amongst the lay populations, and we now have 16 cases of dish. Moving away from the spine, but often implicating the spine, are fractures, which are common in a society which is dependent on physical labor. These could be well set depending on the nature of the fracture, and we know about the application of splints from text sources, such as that for someone who fell from the second floor and described in the life of St. Wilfrid. By far the most frequent form of fractures observed on the bones are those on the long bones, followed by broken ribs, cracked skulls, and more seriously, the occasional broken vertebrae. Not all fractures or wounds can be set, and on occasion there is no other solution than to amputate, which carries some risks of hemorrhaging and infection. We know that amputations took place, but they also appear in the laws as a punishment for transgression, so we cannot be sure whether amputees received surgery on account of their ill health or as a punishment for stealing. Amputations are discussed as a treatment for gangrene in Ball's Leech book, and there are examples of amputated limbs found in cemeteries. In contrast to the popular views of Anglo-Saxon England as a period of violence, weapon injuries are actually relatively rare. However, trepanning occurred on several sites. It's not quite clear why trepanning was practiced, and suggestions have ranged from cures for headaches to some medical magical practice. Whatever the reason is behind trepannings, patients generally survive the procedure. The procedure is not described in any of the literary texts, so we do not know if an anesthetic was given to the patient. Technically, Anglo-Saxon leech books include ingredients which could have been pain-killing and antiseptic, such as henbane. Cancer is often regarded as a modern disease, but there is evidence for the disease from our period on skeletal remains. Examples of malignant tumours were found in skeletons from Nasingbury, Essex, as well as on another male skeleton from Standlake in Oxfordshire. Multiple myeloma were noted in an adult from Addingham, West Yorkshire, and a secondary tumours were noted on 3 other skeletons. The term cancer and carcinoma occur in Anglo-Saxon medical texts, but they do not necessarily have the same meaning as our modern words. The forms extant in Old English texts are cancer adel in Ball's Leech book, and cancro, for example, in the Old English translation of the Herbarium, both terms referring to an ulcerous sore and a mouth infection. If anything, the list of diseases and resulting conditions that have been found on skeletal remains underlines that the severely disabled were not discarded, but were part of an Anglo-Saxon community. In order to live into adult age, there must have been a will as well as a method of caring for the sick. Additionally, those who had the misfortune to suffer from a sudden change of circumstances will have had access to help, as for example indicated in the skeleton of a woman at West Haslett. I'm sorry, it's not her, but I couldn't find an image of her, who was severely impaired after suffering a suggested stroke that paralyzed her from the waist down. We know that she suffered this condition for a long time. Her bones had thinned because of the ensuing atrophy of the muscles. The burial of this woman clearly demonstrates how much our interpretation of such evidence depends on our understanding of burial rites in general. Since the care that the woman received, who clearly had to be helped in her daily ablutions as well as being carried, may be contrasted with her burial position, which is being laid out prone, so face down in a ditch, with her feet bound. The binding of feet is interpreted as a ritual in the cemetery report. However, I would like to argue that a person with a severe impairment may have also had her feet bound to keep her legs together. Another instance of a long-standing impairment is a mature male excavated from the Middle Anglo-Saxon cemetery at Nasingbury, which was associated with a nunnery and may have been part of a hospital cemetery. The man suffered from an abnormality which caused the heads of the femurs to fracture. Since he also had an impairment in his arms, so his arms fractured, he would not have been able to use crutches and thus had to be carried for, and he lived well beyond his 50th year of age. A really interesting cemetery, and you're probably wondering, when do I come to the spines, comes from the cemetery of Blacknell Field in Wiltshire. This site was used in the earliest period of the Anglo-Saxon history, from around the late middle 5th to the middle of the 6th century. The skeleton from the sides are usually healthy, and they show no indication of metabolic disease such as rickets. One middle-aged man, and that's him in grave 71, was with a height of 1.80 meters, not just much taller than the others, but he also shows some interesting pathology. Enamel hypoplasia on his teeth shows that he suffered a period of ill health or malnutrition as a child. He was one of 3 individuals with congenital blocked vertebrae, but in his case, it led to kyphosis. L3 and L4 were fused, and C4, 6, T9 and L3 had collapsed. This would have affected his posture, but he also had his lower arm left missing due to amputation, possibly as early as in childhood. We know from Anglo-Saxon laws that the cutting of limbs was used as a punishment, so even if he received this amputation before the age of legal responsibility, which in this period is about the age of 10, he will have lived with a possible stigma in his life. His grave is poor, and just before his death, can I just go back with this? No, sort of previous. So just before his death, his feet were amputated and they were not put into the grave. We would really like to know whether this was a medical amputation, did he have any more conditions that made it necessary for him, or was he so poor that he probably was stealing and that it was some kind of an effect of his lifestyle. Anglo-Saxon attitudes towards illness are pragmatic. At a time when little can be done for those who get an injury, ways are found to support those who have an injury, whether by feeding or clothing them or by making them feel more comfortable. The Church tries to give answers to the causation of illness by telling sufferers that they are exalted, that they are so much more God's children than those without blemishes, while at the same time trying to find cures. Early medieval monks had no problem with scientific research. After all, in their eyes, God made the world, and to explain it was to understand him better. We know so much less about their secular counterparts, to the point that we do not know where doctors practiced. In its time, Anglo-Saxon medicine was the nadir of the Western world, trying to learn the best from the past to care for the future. I think that modern health practitioners have inherited a proud tradition, and one that deserves to be rid of the label of Dark Ages. Thank you very much.